Hello and welcome. Tonight, I'm going to whisper to you about one of the most complex and controversial figures in modern history, Joseph Stalin. Known as the Man of Steel, Stalin's rule over the Soviet Union shaped not only the course of Russian history but also the world's geopolitical landscape for decades. His leadership during World War II, his brutal purges, and his iron-fisted control over Soviet life have made him both feared and revered. In this series, we'll explore Stalin's life from his humble beginnings in Georgia to his rise to power, the terror of his purges, and the immense legacy he left behind. We'll delve into the key moments of his rule, moments that changed the Soviet Union and the world forever. So, sit back, relax, and join me as we uncover the story of Joseph Stalin, a man whose name still echoes in history. The early years, Stalin's childhood and revolutionary beginnings. Joseph Stalin, originally born as Iosif Vissarionis Dzhivishvili, entered the world on December 18, 1878, in the small Georgian town of Gori. His early life was steeped in poverty, hardship, and a tumultuous family environment. His father, Vissarion Dzhivishvili, was a cobbler who struggled with alcoholism and often abused his family. Meanwhile, his mother, Ketevin Geladze, was a devout Christian who worked tirelessly as a laundress to provide a better life for her son. The conflicting dynamics within his household, his father's violence and his mother's unwavering support, profoundly shaped the young Stalin's developing worldview. Despite the adversity of his early life, Stalin exhibited academic promise. His mother dreamed that he would one day become a priest, and at the age of 10, she enrolled him in a local church school. Young Stalin excelled in his studies and was later awarded a scholarship to the prestigious Tiflis Theological Seminary in the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. However, it was within the walls of this religious institution that Stalin's ideological transformation began to take shape. While training to be a priest, Stalin was introduced to the works of Karl Marx and other revolutionary thinkers. These writings, which criticized the very societal structures he was being taught to uphold, ignited a radical shift in his beliefs. Soon, Stalin began questioning the religious teachings of the seminary, becoming more aligned with Marxist ideals. By the time he was in his late teens, Stalin had completely abandoned his theological education, choosing instead to devote himself to the revolutionary cause. Stalin's early revolutionary activities were fraught with risk. In 1899, having left the seminary, he became deeply involved with underground Marxist groups, distributing revolutionary literature and organizing strikes against the Tsarist regime. It was during this period that he adopted the alias Koba, a reference to a Georgian folk hero who fought against oppression. The name Koba would become a symbol of Stalin's resolve to fight for what he believed in, using any means necessary. Stalin's early revolutionary work quickly gained the attention of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, particularly the Bolshevik faction led by Vladimir Lenin. Stalin was known for his organizational skills, ability to inspire workers, and, most importantly, his fearlessness. He was involved in a series of strikes, protests, and even daring bank robberies, all designed to fund the revolutionary cause. His reputation as a committed revolutionary grew, especially for his role in the 1907 Tiflis bank robbery, which netted the Bolsheviks a significant sum of money. However, Stalin's revolutionary life also came with frequent imprisonments and exiles. His activities led to multiple arrests by Tsarist authorities, and he was exiled to Siberia several times. Yet, Stalin's resilience was unwavering. He managed to escape from exile on several occasions, returning to his revolutionary activities each time with renewed determination. This period of exile and return not only solidified Stalin's reputation as a tenacious revolutionary but also forged the pragmatic, ruthless character that would define his later rule. During his time in the underground revolutionary movement, Stalin began to form crucial alliances with other Bolshevik leaders, including Lenin. Although Stalin was not yet a central figure in the party, his loyalty, efficiency, and willingness to take on dangerous assignments earned him Lenin's trust. Over the years, Stalin became an essential part of the Bolshevik infrastructure, slowly positioning himself for greater roles within the party. Stalin's early years of revolutionary activity were pivotal in shaping his approach to power and control. His exposure to the harsh realities of life under Tsarist rule, combined with the personal hardships he endured during his youth, ingrained in him a belief in the necessity of absolute control to achieve revolutionary success. His experience as a young revolutionary also fostered a deep sense of paranoia and a readiness to eliminate any opposition, traits that would later define his reign over the Soviet Union. These formative years laid the groundwork for Stalin's rise to power, establishing him as a key figure in the Bolshevik movement and setting the stage for his eventual takeover of the Soviet Union. From the humble streets of Gori to the perilous underground world of revolutionary politics, Stalin's early life was one of struggle, determination, and a relentless drive toward power. As we continue this exploration, we will examine Stalin's path to leadership, his ascent within the Bolshevik Party, and the power struggles that would ultimately lead him to the top of the Soviet hierarchy. The rise to power, Stalin's path to leadership. After years of underground revolutionary activities and brushes with the law, Joseph Stalin's ascent to power truly began in the chaotic aftermath of the Russian Revolution. The fall of the Romanov dynasty and the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917 created a political landscape ripe for change and for ambitious individuals like Stalin to rise through the ranks. When Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks to victory in October 1917, Stalin was still a relatively obscure figure within the party. While other revolutionaries, such as Leon Trotsky, played prominent roles during the revolution itself, Stalin worked more quietly behind the scenes. His reputation as a dependable and effective organizer earned him key administrative roles within the new Soviet government. Lenin recognized Stalin's capabilities and appointed him to critical positions that would lay the groundwork for his eventual rise. Stalin's first significant post in the Soviet government was as People's Commissar for Nationalities Affairs, a position that allowed him to manage the delicate issue of the diverse ethnic groups within the Soviet Union. This role provided Stalin with valuable experience in managing internal conflicts and consolidating power in regions where ethnic tensions threatened the stability of the newly formed state. His approach to these issues was marked by pragmatism and an early sign of his ruthless methods, favoring central control and force over diplomacy. However, Stalin's true rise began in 1922 when he was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that, at the time, seemed unremarkable. In fact, many within the party viewed the role as bureaucratic and administrative, rather than one of leadership. But Stalin saw the potential of this position and used it to his advantage. As General Secretary, Stalin was responsible for overseeing party membership, assignments, and communications. This gave him access to an extensive network of loyal followers and allowed him to place his supporters in key positions throughout the party. This administrative power, often underestimated by his rivals, became the foundation of Stalin's growing influence. While others debated ideology and policy, Stalin quietly built a base of loyalists within the Communist Party, carefully maneuvering himself into a position of greater authority. He understood the importance of controlling the machinery of power, and his role as General Secretary allowed him to do just that. During this period, Lenin's health began to decline, and a power struggle emerged over who would succeed him as the leader of the Soviet Union. Lenin himself had growing concerns about Stalin's increasing power and even warned against him in his famous testament. In this document, written shortly before Lenin's death, he criticized Stalin's abrasive personality and suggested that he should be removed from his position as General Secretary. However, this document was kept largely secret from the wider party, and Stalin managed to maintain his grip on power. Lenin's death in 1924 triggered a fierce leadership battle between Stalin and his main rival, Leon Trotsky. Trotsky, a charismatic leader and one of the architects of the Red Army, was widely seen as Lenin's natural successor. However, Stalin's political cunning and his ability to manipulate internal party dynamics gave him the upper hand. He positioned himself as a more moderate figure, contrasting Trotsky's more radical policies with a call for socialism in one country, the idea that the Soviet Union should focus on strengthening itself internally rather than spreading revolution abroad. This strategy resonated with many within the party who were wary of Trotsky's internationalist agenda and who valued stability after years of revolution and civil war. Stalin formed alliances with key figures within the Communist Party, including Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, who initially supported him in sidelining Trotsky. Over time, Stalin turned against these former allies, isolating them and consolidating his power even further. By the late 1920s, Stalin had successfully outmaneuvered all his rivals. Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party, exiled from the Soviet Union, and later assassinated on Stalin's orders in 1940. Kamenev and Zinoviev, once powerful figures, were similarly marginalized and later executed during Stalin's Great Purge. With his rivals eliminated, Stalin stood unchallenged as the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's rise to power was marked by his mastery of political intrigue, his ability to build a network of loyalists, and his ruthless approach to eliminating opposition. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Stalin did not rely on personal charisma or revolutionary heroism to ascend to power. Instead, he quietly and methodically worked behind the scenes, accumulating power in seemingly mundane administrative roles until he had complete control over the party and the state. As Stalin consolidated his power, the Soviet Union entered a new phase of its history, one marked by rapid industrialization, the collectivization of agriculture, and the imposition of a totalitarian regime that would define the Soviet state for decades to come. In the next chapter, we will explore one of the darkest periods of Stalin's rule, the Great Purge, when Stalin's paranoia and desire for absolute control led to the imprisonment and execution of millions. The Great Purge, Stalin's reign of terror. By the mid-1930s, Joseph Stalin had consolidated his power, effectively neutralizing his political rivals and securing his position as the leader of the Soviet Union. But for Stalin, mere control over the government was not enough. His desire for absolute authority, combined with a deep-seated paranoia, led to one of the darkest periods in Soviet history, the Great Purge, or as it is sometimes called, the Great Terror. The seeds of the Great Purge were planted in the early 1930s as Stalin began to see enemies everywhere, both real and imagined. His obsession with rooting out any potential threats to his rule grew, and soon he embarked on a campaign to eliminate not just political opponents but anyone who could be perceived as disloyal. The purge would ultimately result in the execution or imprisonment of millions of people, from high-ranking communist officials to ordinary citizens. The purge began to take shape in 1934, following the assassination of Sergei Kirov, a prominent Bolshevik leader and one of Stalin's close associates. Kirov's murder provided Stalin with a perfect pretext to launch a series of purges against his political enemies. Although there is still debate among historians about whether Stalin was directly involved in Kirov's death, what is clear is that Stalin used the assassination as a justification to crack down on dissent within the party. Initially, the targets of Stalin's purges were political figures within the Communist Party. The first phase, known as the Moscow Trials, saw many of Stalin's former allies, including Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and later Nikolai Bukharin, accused of treason and conspiring against the Soviet state. These public show trials were heavily staged, with the defendants often forced to confess to crimes they had not committed. The trials were broadcast across the country, serving as a powerful tool of propaganda to justify Stalin's actions and instill fear within the population. The purges soon expanded beyond the confines of the Communist Party. Stalin's paranoia extended to the military, which he feared could be a source of opposition to his rule. In 1937 and 1938, the Red Army was decimated by purges that targeted many of its top commanders, including Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most brilliant military strategists in the Soviet Union. The loss of experienced military leaders would have devastating consequences for the Soviet Union just a few years later, during the early stages of World War II. Stalin's Great Purge also reached deep into Soviet society. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, played a central role in carrying out Stalin's orders. Under the leadership of Nikolai Yezhov, the NKVD was responsible for arresting, interrogating, and often executing those deemed enemies of the state. No one was safe from suspicion. Intellectuals, artists, scientists, factory workers, and farmers alike found themselves caught up in the purges. Many were sent to the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps scattered across the Soviet Union, where they faced brutal conditions and often death. The purges were fueled by Stalin's use of fear and propaganda to control the population. The Soviet press painted a picture of constant conspiracy and treason, and citizens were encouraged to report any suspicious behavior, even from friends and family. This climate of fear created an atmosphere of mistrust, where neighbors and colleagues turned against each other to avoid becoming targets themselves. One of the most chilling aspects of the Great Purge was the way it infiltrated every aspect of Soviet life. Teachers, factory workers, and even children were taught to be vigilant for signs of disloyalty. The purges became a tool not only for eliminating potential rivals but also for maintaining absolute control over the thoughts and actions of the population. By the time the Great Purge began to wind down in 1939, the toll was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of people had been executed, and millions more had been imprisoned in the Gulag. The psychological scars left on Soviet society would last for generations. Stalin had succeeded in eliminating all opposition, but the cost was the loss of some of the Soviet Union's brightest minds and most capable leaders. The Great Purge solidified Stalin's grip on power, but it also revealed the depth of his paranoia and his willingness to use extreme measures to maintain control. For Stalin, the purge was not just about eliminating real threats, it was about creating an environment where fear and loyalty to him were the only certainties. The legacy of the purge would haunt the Soviet Union for decades, casting a long shadow over Stalin's rule and the country's future. As we move forward in our exploration of Stalin's reign, the next chapter will focus on his ambitious economic policies, particularly the collectivization of agriculture and the industrialization of the Soviet Union, which would reshape the nation but at a tremendous human cost. Collectivization and industrialization, Stalin's economic policies. As Stalin solidified his control over the Soviet Union in the 1930s, he turned his attention to radically transforming the country's economy. Stalin believed that for the Soviet Union to become a global superpower, it needed to rapidly industrialize and modernize its agriculture. These beliefs led to two of the most significant and controversial economic policies of his regime: the collectivization of agriculture and the implementation of the 5-year plans for industrialization. The Soviet Union, under Lenin's new economic policy, NEP, in the 1920s, had allowed a limited amount of private enterprise, particularly in agriculture. Small-scale farmers, known as kulaks, were able to own and operate their land independently. However, Stalin saw this system as incompatible with his vision of a socialist state. He believed that private land ownership and capitalist tendencies among the kulaks were obstacles to building a truly socialist society. His solution was to collectivize agriculture, bringing all farmland under state control and forcing peasants to work on large, collective farms. In 1928, Stalin launched the collectivization program, which aimed to consolidate millions of individual farms into state-run collectives, or kolkhozes. The policy was met with fierce resistance from many peasants, particularly the kulaks, who were unwilling to give up their land and livelihoods. Stalin's government responded with brutal repression. The kulaks were labeled as enemies of the state, and many were deported to remote regions, imprisoned, or executed. This repression became known as the Dekulakization Campaign, a violent purge of rural areas that resulted in the deaths and displacement of millions of people. Collectivization had disastrous consequences for Soviet agriculture. Peasant resistance, combined with poor planning and the disruption of traditional farming methods, led to a catastrophic drop in food production. The result was a series of famines, the most devastating of which occurred in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933. Known as the Holodomor, this man-made famine killed millions of Ukrainians and is considered one of the greatest tragedies of Stalin's rule. Despite the human cost, Stalin remained resolute, believing that collectivization was necessary for the long-term goals of the Soviet state. While collectivization wreaked havoc on the countryside, Stalin's industrialization policies were seen as more successful, though they too came at a significant human cost. In 1928, Stalin introduced the first of several 5-year plans, which set ambitious goals for rapidly expanding the Soviet Union's industrial capacity. The focus was on heavy industries such as steel production, coal mining, and machinery manufacturing. Stalin believed that by industrializing at a breakneck pace, the Soviet Union could catch up with and surpass the capitalist West. The implementation of the 5-year plans was characterized by extraordinary pressure on workers and managers to meet production quotas. Factories operated around the clock, and workers were often subjected to harsh conditions, long hours, and strict discipline. Those who failed to meet the quotas or who were suspected of sabotaging production were labeled as enemies of the state and could be imprisoned or executed. The rapid pace of industrialization led to significant achievements, including the construction of massive infrastructure projects like the Dnieper hydroelectric station and the growth of industrial cities such as Magnitogorsk. Despite these successes, the human cost of Stalin's industrialization was immense. Workers faced dangerous and grueling conditions, and the emphasis on quantity over quality led to widespread inefficiency and waste. Additionally, the focus on heavy industry came at the expense of consumer goods, leading to shortages of basic necessities like food and clothing. Yet, for Stalin, the sacrifices were justified by the need to transform the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower capable of competing on the global stage. By the end of the 1930s, Stalin's economic policies had dramatically reshaped the Soviet Union. The country had become one of the world's leading industrial powers, and the groundwork had been laid for its future role as a major player in global geopolitics. However, the price of this transformation was staggering: millions of lives lost, widespread suffering, and the establishment of a system in which the state controlled every aspect of economic life. Collectivization and industrialization were central to Stalin's vision of a socialist society, but they also reflected his broader approach to governance, a willingness to use extreme measures and tolerate immense human suffering in the pursuit of his goals. The legacy of these policies would continue to shape the Soviet Union long after Stalin's death, with their impact felt across the decades. As we move forward in this exploration of Stalin's life and rule, the next chapter will examine the creation of Stalin's personality cult and the ways in which he used propaganda to solidify his image as the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. The personality cult: Stalin as the man of steel. By the late 1930s, Joseph Stalin had firmly established himself as the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. But beyond his political control, Stalin cultivated an image that went far beyond that of an ordinary leader. Through a carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign, Stalin transformed himself into a near-mythical figure, the embodiment of the Soviet state and the personification of its strength, wisdom, and resilience. This phenomenon became known as Stalin's personality cult. The development of Stalin's personality cult began in the years following Lenin's death, but it reached its height in the 1930s and 1940s. Unlike Lenin, who was revered for his ideological contributions and revolutionary leadership, Stalin's image was crafted as that of a benevolent father figure, a protector of the people and the architect of socialism in the Soviet Union. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly to promote Stalin as the man of steel, a nickname that not only played on the literal translation of his adopted surname but also symbolized his perceived strength and indomitable will. One of the key tools in building Stalin's personality cult was state-controlled propaganda. The Soviet press, radio, and film industries were all mobilized to portray Stalin as a heroic and infallible leader. Newspapers carried daily reports of his achievements, often exaggerating or fabricating his role in key events. Posters and banners depicting Stalin as a larger-than-life figure appeared in every city, town, and village, often showing him alongside Marx, Engels, and Lenin, suggesting that Stalin was the rightful heir to the revolutionary legacy. Statues of Stalin were erected across the Soviet Union, and his image became a permanent fixture in Soviet life. Stalin was often depicted as being close to the people, especially the workers and peasants. He was shown in factories, fields, and military parades, listening attentively to the concerns of ordinary citizens. This was designed to create the illusion that Stalin was always engaged with the needs of the people, despite the fact that, in reality, he lived in isolation, surrounded by a close-knit circle of loyalists. His image as a man of the people was further reinforced by carefully staged photographs and public appearances that presented him as modest and approachable, even though his rule was marked by repression and terror. The cult of personality also extended into literature, art, and music. Writers, poets, and composers were encouraged, and often coerced, to produce works that glorified Stalin and his leadership. Many of these works portrayed Stalin as a wise and visionary leader who guided the Soviet Union through its most difficult challenges. Schoolchildren were taught songs that praised Stalin, and history textbooks were rewritten to place him at the center of every major Soviet achievement. The rewriting of history was a key component of Stalin's cult, as it allowed him to erase the contributions of rivals and enemies, particularly Leon Trotsky, who was virtually erased from the official narrative of the Russian Revolution. The most extreme manifestations of Stalin's personality cult occurred during the Great Purge and the years of political repression. Even as Stalin's government was imprisoning and executing millions of people, propaganda continued to depict him as a wise and just ruler. Fear and adulation were combined in a potent mix, as many Soviet citizens came to believe that Stalin was a godlike figure who could do no wrong. To question Stalin's decisions, or even to fail to praise him adequately, was seen as an act of treason, punishable by imprisonment or death. The cult of personality was not limited to the Soviet Union. Stalin's image as a heroic leader spread internationally, particularly among communist parties and sympathizers around the world. In countries like China, North Korea, and Cuba, Stalin's image was held up as an ideal model of leadership, inspiring other leaders to develop their own cults of personality. Mao Zedong in China, Kim Il-sung in North Korea, and Fidel Castro in Cuba all drew on the methods used by Stalin to cultivate their own images of invincibility and heroism. While the personality cult elevated Stalin to near-divine status, it also isolated him from reality. As he surrounded himself with sycophants who feared contradicting him, Stalin became increasingly disconnected from the real conditions of the Soviet Union. His decisions, particularly in the years leading up to World War II, were often based on misinformation, as few dared to bring him bad news or challenge his assumptions. The personality cult thus had a paradoxical effect. While it cemented Stalin's control over the Soviet state, it also led to poor decision-making that would have devastating consequences for the Soviet Union. The cult of Stalin continued to dominate Soviet life until his death in 1953. After his passing, his successors, particularly Nikita Khrushchev, began to dismantle the cult, denouncing Stalin's excesses and initiating a process of de-Stalinization. However, the legacy of Stalin's personality cult remained deeply embedded in Soviet society and politics, influencing future generations of leaders both in the Soviet Union and beyond. As we move into the next chapter, we will examine Stalin's leadership during World War II, exploring how he managed the Soviet war effort and how his decisions shaped the outcome of one of the most critical conflicts in modern history. World War II, Stalin and the Great Patriotic War. As Europe descended into war in 1939, Joseph Stalin found himself navigating one of the most turbulent and dangerous periods of his leadership. For the Soviet Union, World War II, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, would become a defining moment in Stalin's rule. The decisions he made during the conflict, both good and bad, would shape the future of the Soviet Union and establish Stalin as one of the most significant figures of the 20th century. At the onset of the war, Stalin sought to protect the Soviet Union from immediate conflict by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in August 1939. This non-aggression pact, named after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, shocked the world. It was an unlikely alliance between two ideologically opposed regimes, Fascist Germany and Communist Soviet Union. In addition to agreeing not to attack each other, the pact also secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with the Soviet Union gaining control over parts of Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. For Stalin, the pact was a pragmatic move. It allowed the Soviet Union to avoid immediate involvement in the war while gaining territory and buying time to strengthen its military. However, Stalin's belief that the pact would protect the Soviet Union from German aggression was a grave miscalculation. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, sending millions of German troops into Soviet territory. The initial stages of the invasion were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Stalin, who had ignored warnings of an impending attack, was caught off guard. In the early months of the war, the Soviet military suffered devastating losses as the German army rapidly advanced, capturing vast territories and encircling entire Soviet divisions. Stalin retreated to his dacha in shock and was reportedly paralyzed by indecision for several days. However, Stalin quickly recovered from this initial setback and assumed direct control of the Soviet war effort. He took on the role of Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces and moved the Soviet government to Moscow, signaling his determination to defend the capital at all costs. Despite his earlier mistakes, Stalin's leadership during the war became increasingly decisive. He reorganized the Soviet military, appointing experienced commanders such as Georgy Zhukov to key positions, and ordered the mobilization of the entire Soviet population for the war effort. The Battle of Moscow in the winter of 1941 to 1942 marked a turning point in the war. The German advance was halted, and Soviet forces launched a counteroffensive, driving the Germans back from the outskirts of the city. This victory, coupled with Stalin's powerful propaganda efforts, helped to galvanize the Soviet people, who viewed the war as a fight for the very survival of their nation. Stalin's ability to rally the Soviet Union was critical to the eventual success of the Red Army. The Soviet Union's industrialization efforts, begun under Stalin's 5-year plans, enabled the country to produce vast amounts of war material, including tanks, planes, and artillery. Factories were moved eastward, away from the front lines, and operated around the clock to supply the military. The Soviet Union also received significant aid from the United States and Great Britain under the Lend-Lease program, which provided critical supplies such as trucks, food, and ammunition. The war's most decisive moment came with the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles in history. Hitler's obsession with capturing the city that bore Stalin's name became a symbolic fight for both sides. Stalin ordered that the city be defended at all costs, and Soviet forces, under General Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive that encircled and ultimately destroyed the German Sixth Army. The victory at Stalingrad was a turning point in the war, marking the beginning of the Soviet Union's advance westward into Eastern Europe. As the war progressed, Stalin's role in shaping the Allied strategy grew. At the Tehran Conference, 1943, and later at the Yalta Conference, 1945, Stalin met with Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt to discuss the post-war order. Stalin was a shrewd negotiator, ensuring that the Soviet Union would have significant influence over Eastern Europe after the war. His demands for a buffer zone of socialist states between the Soviet Union and Western Europe laid the groundwork for the Cold War that would follow. Stalin's wartime leadership, while successful in military terms, was also marked by his characteristic brutality. The Great Purge of the 1930s had decimated the Soviet military leadership, and Stalin's paranoia continued throughout the war. Many Soviet commanders who achieved great victories were later sidelined or executed, as Stalin feared their growing popularity could threaten his power. Additionally, millions of Soviet citizens were deported, imprisoned, or executed for alleged collaboration with the Germans, particularly in regions such as Ukraine and the Baltic states. Despite these atrocities, Stalin emerged from World War II as a hero in the eyes of many Soviet citizens. The Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front, suffering the highest casualties of any nation involved in the war, an estimated 27 million people. The victory over Nazi Germany solidified Stalin's position as one of the most powerful leaders in the world, and his influence extended far beyond the Soviet Union. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore Stalin's role in the post-war period and the origins of the Cold War, examining how the legacy of his wartime leadership shaped the world in the years that followed. Post-war Soviet Union, Stalin's role in the Cold War. In the aftermath of World War II, Joseph Stalin found himself at the helm of a vastly expanded Soviet Union, with the Red Army having liberated much of Eastern Europe from Nazi occupation. While the war had brought immense suffering to the Soviet people, it had also elevated Stalin to the status of a global leader. With Nazi Germany defeated, the world order was on the brink of a new era, the Cold War. This ideological conflict between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, primarily the United States, would dominate global politics for the next 4 decades, with Stalin playing a pivotal role in its origins. Stalin's vision for the post-war world was heavily influenced by his experiences during the war. The Soviet Union had suffered the highest casualties of any nation, and Stalin was determined to prevent a future invasion by creating a buffer zone of friendly, communist states in Eastern Europe. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin met with Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt to negotiate the post-war settlement. While agreeing in principle to free elections in Eastern Europe, Stalin had no intention of allowing these countries to adopt democratic systems that might threaten Soviet control. By 1946, Stalin had consolidated Soviet influence over Eastern Europe, establishing communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. These countries became known as satellite states, and their governments were carefully controlled by Moscow. Stalin's goal was to create a sphere of influence that would protect the Soviet Union from any future aggression from the West. The division of Germany, with East Germany under Soviet control and West Germany aligned with the Western powers, symbolized the deepening rift between the two sides. The ideological confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West became apparent when Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, declaring that Europe was divided between the free nations of the West and the totalitarian regimes in the East. Stalin, ever suspicious of Western intentions, interpreted this speech as a declaration of hostility and prepared for a prolonged struggle against capitalism and imperialism. Stalin's control over Eastern Europe was solidified through a combination of political repression, economic control, and military presence. In 1947, the Cominform, Communist Information Bureau, was established to coordinate the policies of communist parties across Europe, ensuring they remained loyal to the Soviet Union. Economically, Stalin introduced the Molotov Plan to provide financial aid to Eastern European states, countering the Marshall Plan introduced by the United States to aid the recovery of Western Europe. The Molotov Plan helped integrate Eastern Europe into a Soviet-led economic bloc, further entrenching Stalin's influence. The Cold War intensified with the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949, one of the first major confrontations between the Soviet Union and the West. In response to the Western Allies' decision to introduce a new currency in West Berlin, Stalin ordered a blockade of the city, cutting off all land and rail access in an attempt to force the Western powers out. However, the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation by the United States and its allies to supply the city by air, thwarted Stalin's plans. The blockade was eventually lifted, but the division of Berlin became a lasting symbol of the Cold War. During this period, Stalin also pursued nuclear weapons development, determined to match the United States' atomic capabilities. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, ending the American monopoly on nuclear weapons and ushering in a dangerous new phase of the Cold War, the arms race. The world now faced the prospect of mutually assured destruction, with both superpowers possessing the capability to annihilate each other with nuclear weapons. Stalin's foreign policy during the early Cold War was characterized by an aggressive stance against Western influence and a commitment to spreading communism globally. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, was one of the most significant conflicts of this period. Stalin supported North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, in its invasion of South Korea, providing weapons, military advisors, and financial aid. Although Stalin avoided direct Soviet involvement in the fighting, the war marked a significant escalation in the global struggle between communism and capitalism, with the United States and its allies supporting South Korea. At home, Stalin's post-war policies continued to reflect his paranoia and desire for absolute control. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war as a global superpower, but the human cost was staggering. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens had died. Despite this, Stalin showed little compassion for the suffering of his people. Instead, he focused on rebuilding the Soviet economy through a series of 5-year plans aimed at further industrializing the country and restoring its military strength. Stalin's suspicion of potential rivals and enemies also remained as strong as ever. The post-war years saw renewed purges within the Communist Party, particularly targeting those who had been involved in the war effort and gained prominence as military or political leaders. Figures such as Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who had played a key role in the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, found themselves sidelined or demoted, as Stalin feared their growing influence. By the early 1950s, Stalin's health had begun to decline, but his grip on power remained firm. His last years were marked by increasing isolation and paranoia, with new purges, particularly targeting Jewish intellectuals and doctors, taking place in the so-called Doctor's Plot. Stalin's death in March 1953 brought an end to an era, but the Cold War he helped to shape would continue for decades. The legacy of Stalin's role in the Cold War is complex. On one hand, his aggressive expansion of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe and his confrontational stance towards the West laid the foundations for the Cold War that would dominate global politics for the second half of the 20th century. On the other hand, Stalin's policies created a rigid, repressive system in the Soviet Union and its satellite states, stifling political and economic freedoms for generations. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore Stalin's final years, the impact of his death, and how his legacy was re-examined in the decades that followed. The Gulag System, life in Stalin's labor camps. One of the darkest aspects of Joseph Stalin's reign was the vast system of forced labor camps known as the Gulag. The Gulag network was spread across the Soviet Union, from the freezing tundras of Siberia to the desolate forests of the far north, and its name became synonymous with terror, suffering, and oppression. Under Stalin's leadership, the Gulag system grew into a central pillar of the Soviet economy, using the forced labor of millions of prisoners to fuel the country's rapid industrialization and infrastructure projects. However, it was also a tool of political repression, where dissenters, perceived enemies of the state, and ordinary citizens alike were sent to endure years of brutal conditions. The Gulag system had its origins in the early years of the Soviet Union, but it expanded dramatically under Stalin. During the 1930s, as Stalin initiated the Great Purge, millions of people were arrested on charges of treason, sabotage, or simply being enemies of the people. Many of these individuals were executed, but a significant portion were sent to the labor camps of the Gulag, where they were subjected to grueling physical labor, malnutrition, and often death. Life in the Gulag was extraordinarily harsh. Prisoners, known as zeks, were forced to work in some of the most inhospitable conditions imaginable. They labored in mines, logging camps, construction projects, and factories, often performing back-breaking tasks with little more than basic tools. The work was relentless, with prisoners forced to meet daily production quotas, regardless of the weather or their physical health. Those who failed to meet their quotas were punished with reduced food rations, leading to a vicious cycle of hunger, exhaustion, and, eventually, death. The gulags were spread across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, with some of the most notorious camps located in the Kolyma region of Siberia, where prisoners were forced to mine for gold in freezing temperatures, and in Vorkuta, a remote area north of the Arctic Circle where prisoners worked in coal mines. The extreme climate in these regions added to the already brutal conditions, with temperatures in some camps dropping as low as -50 degrees Celsius in the winter. Many prisoners were ill-equipped to survive such conditions, and thousands died from exposure, starvation, or disease. The population of the Gulag camps was diverse, including political prisoners, ordinary criminals, and even individuals who had been falsely accused of crimes. Intellectuals, artists, scientists, and military officers who had once been loyal to the Soviet state found themselves imprisoned alongside common thieves and murderers. During the Great Purge, many of Stalin's former comrades within the Communist Party, including prominent figures such as Grigory Zinoviev and Nikolai Bukharin, were arrested, tried in show trials, and either executed or sent to the Gulag. The Gulag also became a mechanism for controlling ethnic minorities and groups considered to be threats to the Soviet state. Entire populations, such as the Chechens, Tatars, and Volga Germans, were deported en masse to remote areas of the Soviet Union and forced to live in labor camps. These mass deportations were part of Stalin's broader effort to suppress any potential nationalist movements that could challenge Soviet authority. Despite the horrific conditions, some prisoners survived the Gulag and later recounted their experiences. The most famous of these survivors was the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose book The Gulag Archipelago exposed the brutality of the Soviet labor camps to the world. Published in the 1970s, Solzhenitsyn's work played a key role in shedding light on the atrocities committed under Stalin's regime and helped to demystify the Soviet state's narrative of progress and modernization. The economic role of the Gulag system cannot be overlooked. While the camps were primarily intended as a means of political repression, they also became an integral part of the Soviet economy. Prisoners provided a cheap, expendable labor force for large-scale infrastructure projects such as the construction of the Belomor Canal and the development of the Trans-Siberian Railway. However, the inefficiency and high mortality rates of the camps meant that the economic benefits were often outweighed by the immense human suffering they caused. The Gulag System continued to operate throughout Stalin's reign, and even after his death in 1953, it took several years for the camps to be fully dismantled. Under Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, efforts were made to reduce the scope of the Gulag and to rehabilitate many of the prisoners who had been unjustly convicted. Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign sought to distance the Soviet Union from the excesses of Stalin's regime, and the horrors of the Gulag were publicly condemned for the first time. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Gulag system left a deep scar on Soviet society. Millions of families were torn apart, and the fear of being arrested and sent to the camps pervaded everyday life during Stalin's rule. The survivors of the Gulag, many of whom struggled with lifelong trauma, became symbols of the brutal repression that characterized the Soviet state under Stalin. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore the final years of Stalin's life, his declining health, and the legacy he left behind after his death in 1953 as the Soviet Union entered a new era. The final years, Stalin's decline and death. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Joseph Stalin's rule over the Soviet Union seemed unshakable. He had led the Soviet people through the devastation of World War II, expanded Soviet influence across Eastern Europe, and established himself as one of the most powerful leaders in the world. However, as Stalin aged, his health deteriorated, and his reign became increasingly characterized by paranoia, isolation, and fear. The final years of Stalin's life were marked by renewed purges, political intrigue, and growing tensions with his inner circle, signaling that even the most powerful leaders are not immune to the ravages of time. Stalin's health began to noticeably decline after World War II. He suffered from a number of chronic ailments, including high blood pressure and heart disease, which worsened with age. Despite his failing health, Stalin refused to delegate significant power to his subordinates and maintained tight control over the Soviet government. His paranoia, which had been a defining trait throughout his reign, only intensified during these final years. Stalin became increasingly suspicious of those around him, fearing that they might plot to overthrow him or undermine his authority. One of the most infamous episodes of Stalin's final years was the so-called Doctors' Plot of 1952 to 1953. Stalin became convinced that a group of predominantly Jewish doctors in the Soviet Union was conspiring to assassinate him and other senior leaders. This alleged conspiracy, fabricated by Stalin's secret police, led to the arrest and torture of dozens of doctors, many of whom were accused of being foreign agents. The Doctors' Plot was part of a broader wave of anti-Semitism that swept through the Soviet Union in Stalin's final years, reflecting his deepening paranoia and xenophobia. Many feared that Stalin was preparing for another mass purge similar to those of the 1930s, but his death in 1953 prevented the full implementation of this campaign. Stalin's relationships with his closest advisors and allies also grew increasingly strained during this period. Figures such as Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the Soviet secret police, and Georgy Malenkov, a key political figure, became embroiled in power struggles as Stalin's health deteriorated. These men, once fiercely loyal to Stalin, began positioning themselves for the inevitable succession battle that would follow his death. Despite their loyalty, even they were not immune to Stalin's suspicions. Many in his inner circle lived in constant fear of falling out of favor and facing execution or imprisonment. Stalin's isolation from reality deepened in his final years. He spent much of his time at his dacha outside Moscow, rarely appearing in public and limiting his interactions to a small group of trusted associates. His leadership, once characterized by brutal decisiveness, now appeared erratic and unpredictable. Stalin's insistence on maintaining absolute control over every aspect of the Soviet government led to widespread inefficiency and a growing sense of stagnation within the party. On the night of March 1, 1953, Stalin suffered a severe stroke at his dacha. He was discovered by his guards the next morning, but several hours passed before medical help was summoned, a delay that some historians believe was intentional, as Stalin's subordinates hesitated to act without clear orders. By the time doctors arrived, it was too late to save him. Stalin lingered for several days in a comatose state before passing away on March 5, 1953. His death marked the end of an era in Soviet history, but it also triggered a fierce struggle for power among his successors. The immediate aftermath of Stalin's death was characterized by uncertainty and fear. His sudden passing left a power vacuum at the top of the Soviet hierarchy, and key figures within the government, including Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, and Lavrentiy Beria, jockeyed for control. Stalin's death also prompted a re-evaluation of his legacy within the Soviet Union. While he had led the country to victory in World War II and transformed it into a global superpower, the immense human cost of his purges, forced labor camps, and economic policies could no longer be ignored. Stalin's funeral was a grand and elaborate affair, attended by hundreds of thousands of mourners. His body was placed on display in the Hall of Columns in Moscow's House of the Unions, and his coffin was later carried through the streets in a procession to Red Square, where he was initially interred alongside Lenin in the mausoleum. However, as the Soviet leadership began the process of de-Stalinization in the years following his death, Stalin's image underwent a dramatic shift. Nikita Khrushchev, who emerged as the dominant figure in the post-Stalin power struggle, denounced Stalin's crimes in his famous secret speech of 1956, marking the beginning of a gradual dismantling of Stalin's cult of personality. In 1961, as part of the de-Stalinization campaign, Stalin's body was removed from Lenin's mausoleum and reburied in a more modest grave near the Kremlin wall. His legacy, once celebrated as that of a heroic leader, was now viewed with a much more critical lens. The horrors of the purges, the mass repression, and the suffering endured by millions of Soviet citizens could no longer be ignored, and Stalin's image was forever tarnished. The final years of Stalin's life were a stark contrast to the earlier periods of his reign. Once a powerful and feared leader, Stalin's last days were marked by paranoia, fear, and isolation. His death brought an end to one of the most brutal dictatorships in modern history, but the legacy of his rule would continue to shape the Soviet Union for decades to come. As we move into the final chapter of this series, we will explore the long-term legacy of Stalin, how he is remembered today, both in Russia and around the world, and the lasting impact of his rule on the course of history. The legacy of Stalin, controversial figure of history. Joseph Stalin's legacy remains one of the most complex and controversial in modern history. Revered by some as the architect of the Soviet Union's transformation into a global superpower, and vilified by others as one of history's most brutal dictators, Stalin's impact continues to be debated by historians, political leaders, and ordinary people to this day. On the one hand, Stalin's leadership during World War II and the Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazi Germany are undeniable accomplishments. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union emerged as a global superpower with significant influence over Eastern Europe and a dominant position in the Cold War. The industrialization and modernization efforts he oversaw, although achieved at a tremendous human cost, transformed the Soviet Union from a largely agrarian society into a major industrial nation capable of competing with the West. For many in Russia and other former Soviet states, Stalin is still remembered as a strong leader who defended the country against external threats and helped to secure its status as a world power. Monuments to Stalin remain in some parts of the former Soviet Union, and his image is occasionally invoked in contemporary Russian political discourse as a symbol of national strength and resilience. However, the darker aspects of Stalin's legacy cannot be overlooked. The millions of lives lost during the Great Purge, the Holodomor, and the Gulag System have left an indelible stain on his record. The repression and mass executions of political opponents, the forced deportations of ethnic minorities, and the creation of a climate of fear and paranoia have led many to view Stalin as a tyrant whose obsession with power caused immense suffering. The process of de-Stalinization that began after his death, particularly under Nikita Khrushchev, aimed to dismantle Stalin's cult of personality and expose the atrocities committed during his rule. Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech, in which he denounced Stalin's crimes, marked a turning point in Soviet history, and many of Stalin's policies were reversed in the years that followed. Monuments to Stalin were torn down, cities and streets named after him were renamed, and history books were rewritten to reflect a more critical view of his leadership. Despite these efforts, Stalin's legacy remains a source of contention. In Russia today, public opinion about Stalin is divided, with some viewing him as a necessary force for national unity and progress, while others condemn the brutality of his regime. This ambivalence reflects the broader struggle to reconcile the achievements of the Soviet Union under Stalin with the horrific human toll of his policies. Internationally, Stalin is remembered primarily as a dictator who, through fear and repression, maintained his grip on power for nearly 3 decades. His name has become synonymous with totalitarianism, and his methods of control, ranging from show trials and purges to mass surveillance and forced labor camps, are often cited as examples of the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism. As the world continues to grapple with the legacy of Joseph Stalin, his impact on history remains undeniable. He shaped the course of the 20th century in profound ways, from his role in World War II to the rise of the Soviet Union as a global superpower. Yet, the human cost of his leadership, millions of lives lost, families torn apart, and entire populations displaced, casts a long shadow over his achievements. Stalin's legacy serves as a stark reminder of the complexities of power and leadership. His ability to transform a nation through sheer force of will is both a testament to his political acumen and a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. The lessons of Stalin's rule continue to resonate today, offering insights into the nature of dictatorship, the consequences of political repression, and the enduring struggle for justice and human rights. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and legacy of Joseph Stalin. I hope you found this exploration of his controversial and complex role in history as fascinating as I did. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future topics as we continue to dive into the untold stories of history together. Until next time, take care and stay curious.